I remember the night I first met Diana like it was yesterday. I had just finished a long day at work and decided to unwind at my favorite bar, a small, dimly lit place where the music was low and the drinks were strong. It was the kind of place where you could sit back and forget the world for a while. As I nursed my drink at the bar, I noticed a couple arguing in the corner. It wasn't unusual to see people having a spat after a few too many drinks, but something about this argument caught my attention. The woman, a striking blonde with a nervous smile, was trying to calm the situation, but the man she was with was having none of it. He was drunk, loud, and getting increasingly aggressive. I could see the fear in her eyes as he grabbed her arm, his voice rising in anger. That's when something in me snapped. I wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business, but this felt different. I couldn't just sit there and watch this guy terrorize her. I stood up and walked over to them, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "why don't you just back off?" The guy turned to me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. He looked me up and down, sizing me up. "Mind your own business," he slurred, but I wasn't about to back down. "Let her go," I said more firmly this time. The woman, who I would later come to know as Diana, looked at me with a mixture of surprise and relief. The guy, however, wasn't about to listen to reason. Before I knew it, he swung at me, and the next thing I knew, we were in a full-blown brawl. The fight didn't last long, but it was intense. We knocked over a few chairs, and I ended up with a split lip, but eventually the bouncers stepped in and dragged the guy out, kicking and screaming. I was left standing there, out of breath and slightly dazed, with Diana looking at me with wide eyes. "Are you okay?" I asked her, wiping the blood from my lip. She nodded, still shaken. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do that." I shrugged, trying to play it cool, but my heart was still racing. "I couldn't just sit there and do nothing," I replied. She gave me a small smile, one that hinted at the strength beneath the fear. "I'm Diana," she said, holding out her hand. "Pete," I responded, shaking her hand. "Nice to meet you, even under these circumstances." She laughed softly, and I could see the tension beginning to fade from her face. "I should go," she said after a moment, glancing towards the door. "But thank you again, Pete. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stepped in." "Anytime," I said, watching her leave, not realizing at that moment how much that night would change my life. The next week I found myself back at the bar. I wasn't expecting to see Diana again, but there she was, sitting at the same table where the fight had happened. Our eyes met across the room and she smiled, a real smile this time, and waved me over. "I've been looking for you," she said as I sat down. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did last week." "No need to thank me," I replied, though I was secretly glad she had found me. "I'm just glad you're okay." She nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "I broke up with him, you know, that guy from last week. We'd been on and off for a while, but what happened? It made me realize I needed to end it for good." I wasn't sure what to say, so I just nodded. "Sounds like the right decision." "It was," she said firmly, and for the first time I could see the determination in her eyes. "And I was wondering, would you like to go out for coffee sometime? As a thank you?" I was taken aback by her offer, but quickly recovered. "I'd like that," I said, smiling. "I'd like that a lot." That coffee turned into dinner, and dinner turned into more dates. Before I knew it, we were spending every spare moment together. Diana was everything I didn't know I was looking for: funny, smart, and incredibly strong. She had been through a lot, but she never let it break her. Instead, she came out of it all even stronger. We dated for a couple of years, and I fell more in love with her every day. I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her, so one night in that same bar where we met, I got down on one knee and asked her to marry me. When she said yes, it felt like everything in my life had finally fallen into place. We got married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family. It was the happiest day of my life, but the happiness didn't end there. A year later, Diana gave birth to our beautiful daughter Samantha. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I knew that this was what life was all about: love, family, and the little moments that make everything else worth it. Looking back on that night in the bar, I realize how different things could have been if I hadn't stepped in. But I did, and it led me to the love of my life and the family I always wanted. And for that, I will be forever grateful. When Samantha left for college, it felt like a chapter of our lives had closed. The house, once filled with the sounds of her laughter, the clatter of her things, and the constant bustle of her presence, suddenly became eerily quiet. Diana and I had always known this day would come, but nothing quite prepared us for the emptiness that followed. For the first time in a long time, it was just the two of us. At first it was nice. We had more time to ourselves, more freedom to do the things we'd put off for years. But as the weeks turned into months, I started to notice a change, something subtle but undeniable. The easy comfort we once shared began to feel more like routine, and the passion that had defined our early years together seemed to have faded into the background. I told myself it was normal, that after more than 20 years of marriage, the intensity of our early love was bound to mellow. But as time went on, I began to feel like something was missing. It wasn't just that Diana and I weren't as physically close as we used to be, although that was part of it. It was more than that. It was like the connection between us had shifted from something vibrant and alive to something more like a quiet companionship. I tried to shake the feeling, convincing myself that it was all in my head, maybe even just a symptom of getting older. After all, I wasn't a young man anymore. The mirror reminded me of that every morning. Gray hair, lines on my face, the slight paunch that had developed around my middle. Maybe this was just what happened when you reached a certain age. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us. We still talked, still shared the same bed, still spent time together. But it was different. The conversations we had seemed to revolve around everyday matters. Bills, the house, Samantha's latest updates from college. There was a lack of intimacy in our words, a lack of warmth that I found myself missing more and more. And then there was the way I felt when I looked at Diana. She was still beautiful. There was no denying that. But it was a different kind of beauty now, one that was more familiar than exciting. I found myself remembering the way I used to feel about her, the way my heart would race when she walked into a room, the way I couldn't keep my hands off her. Now, I felt a strange detachment, like she was more of a friend than a lover. I wondered if Diana noticed it too. Sometimes I'd catch her looking at me with a distant expression, as if she was seeing me through a different lens. I began to wonder if she felt the same way I did, if she too missed the passion we once had, or worse, if she was beginning to think about what it would be like to be with someone else. The thought gnawed at me. I started to scrutinize her behavior, looking for signs that she might be pulling away, or worse, that she might be interested in someone else. When she spent more time out of the house, going to yoga, meeting up with friends, running errands that seemed to take longer than they should, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it. I hated myself for thinking that way, for doubting her, but the fear was there, lurking in the back of my mind. I knew I wasn't blameless either. I could feel myself drifting, pulling back emotionally, maybe even physically. It wasn't that I didn't love Diana. I did deeply. But it was a different kind of love now, one that was more about comfort and history than desire. I couldn't help but wonder if this was what people meant when they talked about a midlife crisis. Was I really that cliché? Was I just another aging man who couldn't accept the fact that life wasn't as exciting as it used to be? I tried to talk myself out of it, to remind myself of all the good things we had, a beautiful daughter, a stable life, a marriage that had lasted longer than most. But the doubts persisted. I found myself thinking about what it would be like to feel that spark again, to be with someone who made me feel alive in the way Diana once did. It was a selfish thought, and I hated myself for it, but it was there all the same. At night, lying in bed next to Diana, I wondered if she was having the same thoughts. Sometimes I'd lie awake, listening to her breathing, wondering what was going through her mind. Was she happy? Was she content? Or was she, like me, feeling the weight of our years together pressing down on her? I wanted to ask her, to talk about what was happening between us, But every time I opened my mouth to say something, the words caught in my throat. What if she didn't feel the same way? What if I was the only one who felt this growing distance? Or worse, what if she agreed and the conversation led to something I wasn't ready to face? The truth was, I was scared. Scared that the life we'd built together was starting to crumble. Scared that I was losing her. Scared that I didn't know how to fix it. I kept hoping that things would change, that somehow we'd find our way back to each other. But the longer this went on, the more uncertain I became. It wasn't all bad, of course. We still had our good moments, laughing over dinner, reminiscing about the early days, talking about our hopes for Samantha's future. But those moments felt more like echoes of the past than glimpses of the future. And that, more than anything, made me feel lost. I started to pull away, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. I told myself it was better this way, that maybe if I gave Diana some space, she'd come back to me. But the more I distanced myself, the more isolated I felt. It was a lonely place to be, stuck in a marriage where the love was still there, but the passion had faded. I didn't know how to bring it back, and I wasn't sure Diana did either. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me, a thoughtful expression on her face, and I'd wonder if she was having the same doubts, the same fears. But she never said anything, and neither did I. We just went on, day after day, pretending that everything was fine, even though we both knew it wasn't. I began to dread the future. What if this was all there was? What if we were destined to spend the rest of our lives together, side by side, but emotionally miles apart? The thought terrified me, but I didn't know how to change it. I didn't know if it could be changed. And so, we continued on. Two people bound by years of love and history, but slowly drifting apart. I wished I could go back to the days when everything was new and exciting, when just being near Diana was enough to make me feel alive. But those days were gone, and I didn't know how to get them back. All I could do was hope that this was just a phase, that somehow we'd find our way back to each other. But the longer this went on, the more that hope began to fade, replaced by a growing fear that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to gather the courage to talk to Diana about what had been weighing on my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this conversation was inevitable. We had been drifting apart for too long, and the silence between us was starting to feel like a wall, one that was growing taller with each passing day. One evening, after another quiet dinner where we spoke only in passing about mundane things like the weather and grocery lists, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I set my fork down, cleared my throat, and looked across the table at Diana. She glanced up at me, her eyes curious, sensing that something was different. "Diana," I began, my voice a little shaky, "we need to talk." She raised an eyebrow, but there was no surprise in her expression. "About what?" "About us," I said, feeling the weight of those two simple words. About our marriage, our relationship, everything. Diana leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. "Go on," she said, her tone neutral, as if she'd been expecting this. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I've been feeling distant. I mean, I know we've been together for over 20 years and things change, but lately it feels like we're more like roommates than husband and wife." She didn't respond right away, just studied me with that calm, analytical gaze of hers. It was one of the things I'd always admired about her, her ability to think things through without letting emotion cloud her judgment. But right now, I wanted to see some emotion, something to tell me that she felt the same way. "I've noticed it too," she finally said, her voice steady. "We've been going through the motions, haven't we?" "Yeah," I admitted, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness that she understood. "And it's not just about the physical stuff, though that's part of it. It's like we've lost something, some connection we used to have." Diana nodded slowly. "I agree, it's like we've grown comfortable, maybe too comfortable. We know each other so well that there's no excitement anymore, no spark." "That's exactly it," I said, leaning forward, grateful that she was on the same page. "But the thing is, I don't want to lose you. I don't want us to drift so far apart that we can't find our way back." Diana looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the gears turning in her mind. Then she sighed and looked down at her hands. Pete, I need to be honest with you. I've been feeling restless, like I need something more, something different. It's not that I don't love you, I do, very much. But I've been craving variety, something to break the monotony. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. So, what does that mean for us? Do you want out? Do you want to end this? Diana shook her head quickly. No, that's not what I'm saying. Divorce would be ridiculous. We've built a life together, we've raised a daughter, and we still care about each other. But I think we need to find a way to bring something new into our lives, to shake things up. I frowned, trying to make sense of what she was saying. So what do we do? How do we fix this? She thought for a moment, then met my eyes with a determined expression. What if we had a truth night? A night where we put everything on the table, our thoughts, our feelings, our desires, without holding back. No lies, no half-truths. Just pure honesty, even if it's uncomfortable. I blinked, taken aback by the suggestion. A truth night? Yes, she said, her voice gaining strength. We could make it a special night, something like a date. We'll have a romantic dinner, maybe a bottle of wine, and just talk. About everything. The things we've been too afraid to say to each other. The things we might not even want to admit to ourselves. I leaned back in my chair, mulling it over. It was an unconventional idea, but then again, maybe that was exactly what we needed. Something different. Something to break the cycle we'd fallen into. Okay, I said finally. Let's do it. But you have to promise me one thing. What's that? She asked, tilting her head. That we won't let this turn into a fight, I said, my voice firm. No matter what comes up, no matter what we say, we have to remember that we're doing this to make things better, not worse. Diana smiled, a small, genuine smile that I hadn't seen in a while. Agreed. We're doing this because we love each other, and because we want to stay together. That night, after the dishes were cleared and the lights dimmed, we set the date for our truth night. I was nervous but also a little excited. This was a chance to really talk, to get everything out in the open. Maybe, just maybe, it would be the key to finding our way back to each other. The night of our truth night came, and I found myself more anxious than I'd expected. I spent extra time getting ready, making sure everything was perfect. The food, the lighting, even the playlist of our favorite songs playing softly in the background. It felt a bit like the early days of our relationship, when I used to plan special dates just to see the smile on Diana's face. When Diana came down the stairs, I was struck by how beautiful she looked. She had taken the time to dress up, wearing the same dress she'd worn on one of our first anniversaries. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to me. She smiled when she saw the table set with candles and the bottle of wine chilling in the ice bucket. You went all out, she said, walking over to me. I wanted it to be special, I replied, taking her hand and leading her to the table. This is important to me, to us. We sat down, and for a while we just enjoyed the meal, making small talk, almost like we were warming up for the main event. The food was good, and the wine helped to take the edge off my nerves. But as the evening wore on, I knew it was time to start the conversation we'd been avoiding for so long. I cleared my throat, setting down my wine glass. So, how do we start this? Diana smiled, but there was a hint of tension in her eyes. How about we each take turns? I'll ask a question, then you ask one, and we have to answer honestly, no matter how hard it is. Okay, I agreed, nodding. You go first. She took a deep breath and I could see her steeling herself. Pete, do you still find me attractive? The question hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I knew it was coming, but it still caught me off guard. I looked into her eyes, wanting to give her the truth but not wanting to hurt her. I do, I said slowly, but it's different now. It's not that I don't find you attractive. I do, very much. But it's not the same as it was when we were younger. It's more familiar, I guess. And sometimes that makes it harder to feel the same kind of excitement. Diana nodded, her expression unreadable. I felt the same way. I still love you, Pete, but there are times when I miss that feeling of being wanted, of being desired. I think that's part of why I've been restless lately. I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that I had a part in that. I'm sorry, Diana. I never meant to make you feel that way. It's not just you, she said quickly. It's both of us. We've both let things slide, and I think it's been building up for a while. I nodded, knowing she was right. So, what do we do about it? She smiled again, a bit more warmly this time. We work on it. We find ways to bring that excitement back. It won't be easy, but if we're both willing, I think we can do it. I felt a glimmer of hope at her words, and for the first time in a long while, I believed that we could find our way back to each other. Your turn, she said, gesturing for me to ask the next question. I thought for a moment, trying to find the right words. Diana, have you ever thought about being with someone else? Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment I regretted asking. But then she nodded, slowly. I've thought about it, she admitted. Not seriously, but in passing. There have been moments when I've wondered what it would be like to feel that rush again, to be with someone new. The confession stung, but I appreciated her honesty. I've thought about it too, I confessed, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders as I said the words. But I've never acted on it, and I don't want to. I want to be with you. She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. And I want to be with you, Pete. That's why we're doing this, to figure out how to make our relationship stronger. We continued to talk late into the night, asking each other questions that we had been too afraid to ask before. We talked about our fears, our regrets, our hopes for the future. Some of the conversations were painful, but they were also necessary. By the end of the night, I felt like a burden had been lifted, like we had finally broken through the walls that had been separating us. As we finished the last of the wine, Diana leaned back in her chair and looked at me with a softness in her eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. You know, she said, I think this was exactly what we needed, just to be honest with each other, to get everything out in the open. I nodded, feeling a deep sense of relief. Yeah, I think so too. It feels good to be on the same page again. She smiled, and it was a smile that reminded me of the early days when everything was new and exciting. So what now? Now, I said, standing up and offering her my hand. We keep working on it. Together. Diana took my hand, and as we walked upstairs to bed, I felt a renewed sense of hope. We still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, I believed that we could make it. We could find our way back to each other, one step at a time. As we lay in bed that night, I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the warmth of her body against mine. It wasn't the same as it had been 20 years ago, but in a way, it was better. We were older, wiser, and we had been through so much together. And now, we were ready to face whatever came next, side by side. We lay in bed, the room quiet, except for the soft hum of the ceiling fan. The weight of our earlier conversation still hung in the air, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like we had made real progress. I held Diana close, her warmth and familiar scent comforting me. The darkness wrapped around us like a blanket, and I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in months. Just as I was beginning to drift off, Diana shifted beside me. I could tell something was on her mind, and I waited, knowing she would speak when she was ready. After a few moments, she broke the silence. Pete, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Can I ask you something? Of course, I replied, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. She hesitated, and I could feel the tension in her body. Did you ever think about being with someone else, or did you ever want to have an affair? Her question caught me off guard, and I felt a rush of emotions, surprise, guilt, uncertainty. I turned to face her, trying to read her expression in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, vulnerable, but there was something else there too, something I couldn't quite place. I took a deep breath, knowing that honesty was the only option. Diana, I'd be lying if I said the thought never crossed my mind. There were moments when I wondered what it would be like, especially when things were rough between us. But I never acted on it. I couldn't bring myself to do it. I couldn't hurt you like that. She nodded slowly, her gaze steady on mine. I appreciate that, Pete, and I believe you. She paused, her fingers tracing idle patterns on the sheet. But what if I told you that I've had those thoughts too? That sometimes I've wondered what it would be like to be with someone else? I felt a jolt of shock, but it wasn't anger or betrayal. It was more of a realization that we were more alike than I had thought. We had both been struggling with the same doubts, the same temptations, and yet we had both chosen not to act on them. Honestly, Diana, I can't blame you for feeling that way, I said, my voice gentle. We've been through a lot, and it's natural to have those thoughts, especially after so many years together. She sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. I'm glad you understand, but there's something else I want to talk to you about, something I've been thinking about for a while. I raised an eyebrow, curious and a little wary. What is it? Diana bit her lip, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her face before she seemed to make up her mind. What if we gave each other permission to sleep with someone else? Just once. No strings attached, no questions asked. Just one time, to see what it's like. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. I stared at her, my mind struggling to process what she had just said. Wait, are you serious? She nodded, a spark of something, excitement, in her eyes. I know it sounds crazy, but think about it. We've been together for over 20 years, and we've never really had the chance to experience anything else. I'm not saying we're not happy together. I love you, Pete. But maybe this could be a way to bring something new into our lives, to satisfy that curiosity without it threatening what we have. I was stunned. This was not the Diana I knew, the Diana who had always been so committed to our marriage, who had always valued loyalty above all else. But as I looked at her, I realized that this was something she had thought about carefully. She wasn't suggesting it out of spite or boredom. She was genuinely trying to find a way to keep our marriage strong, even if it meant exploring something unconventional. I don't know what to say, I admitted, running a hand through my hair. I mean, I never expected this. She gave me a small, playful smile, one that made her look younger, almost mischievous. I know it's a lot to take in, and I'm not saying we have to do it, but if we did, it would be just once. No questions, no guilt. We'd move on, and it would never be brought up again. I couldn't deny that the idea intrigued me. There was a part of me that had always wondered what it would be like to be with someone else, especially during the rough patches in our marriage. But actually doing it, that was something else entirely. Diana, are you sure about this? I asked, searching her face for any sign of hesitation. I mean, this could change everything. She looked at me with those deep, expressive eyes of hers, and I could see that she was serious. I've thought about it a lot, Pete, and I think it could actually help us. It's like we've been holding on so tightly to this idea of what our marriage should be that we've forgotten to really live. Maybe this could be a way to let go of that pressure, just for a moment, and see where it takes us. I was silent, trying to wrap my head around the idea. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the unknown below. One step, and everything could change, maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. But I also knew that we had been stuck in the same place for too long, and maybe, just maybe, this was the push we needed to move forward. So you're saying we each get one time? I asked slowly, wanting to make sure I understood. One time with someone else and then we come back to each other, no questions asked? That's right, she said, her voice steady. One time and then it's done. We don't talk about it again and we go back to focusing on us. I couldn't believe I was even considering it, but there was something in the way she looked at me. Hopeful, excited, like she was offering me a way out of the rut we'd found ourselves in. And maybe, just maybe, she was right. Maybe this was what we needed to break free of the monotony that had settled over our lives. Okay, I said finally, the word hanging in the air between us. Okay, let's do it. Diana's eyes lit up, and she smiled, A real, genuine smile that I hadn't seen in a long time. Really? You're okay with it? I'm not sure I'm okay with it, I admitted. But I'm willing to try. If it's what you want, and if you think it will help us, then I'm in. She leaned over and kissed me, a kiss that felt different somehow, more intense, more meaningful. Thank you, Pete, she whispered against my lips. Thank you for trusting me. I nodded, still feeling a little dazed. Just promise me that this won't come between us, okay? I don't want this to be something that drives a wedge between us later on. It won't, she promised, her voice firm. This is just a way to let go of some of that tension we've been carrying. It's not about replacing what we have. It's about making what we have even stronger. We lay there in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't help but wonder what this would mean for us, how it would change our relationship, our marriage. Part of me was excited, curious to see where this would lead, but another part of me was nervous, worried that we were opening a door that might be better left closed. As the night wore on, I found it harder and harder to fall asleep. I kept replaying Diana's words in my head, trying to make sense of the emotions swirling inside me. Was this really the right thing to do? Could we go through with it and still come out the other side stronger, more connected? Eventually, I turned to Diana, who was lying beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I watched her for a moment, feeling a surge of affection for this woman who had been by my side for so many years. She was offering me something I never expected, something I wasn't sure I deserved. And yet I couldn't deny that a part of me wanted to take her up on it. Diana, I whispered, my voice barely audible in the darkness. She murmured, half asleep. Do you really think this will help us? That this is the right thing to do? She opened her eyes and looked at me, her expression soft and reassuring. I do, Pete. I really do. But only if we both want it. If you're not sure, we don't have to do it. This isn't about pressure. It's about finding a way to reconnect, to bring some excitement back into our lives. I nodded, feeling a little more at ease. Okay, then let's do it. Let's see where this takes us. She smiled and closed her eyes again, nestling against me. I'm glad, Pete. I think this could be really good for us. As I held her close, I tried to quiet the doubts in my mind, focusing instead on the possibilities ahead. Maybe this was what we needed, a way to break free from the routine and rediscover each other in. It had been about a month since Diana and I had that conversation, the one where we agreed to give each other a single night with someone else. At the time, it had seemed like a radical but necessary step, a way to bring something new into our lives and to break free from the stagnation that had set in. But now, as the days passed, I found myself more conflicted than ever. I couldn't shake the thought of whether Diana had gone through with it. Had she met someone? Was there a night when she wasn't just out with friends, but actually fulfilling the agreement we'd made? The uncertainty gnawed at me day and night, turning over and over in my mind until it became almost unbearable. Every time Diana came home late or mentioned plans that didn't involve me, a part of me wondered. I never asked, though. That was part of the deal. We weren't supposed to ask, weren't supposed to pry or accuse. But the not knowing was worse than I had anticipated. It felt like there was a shadow between us, something unsaid that neither of us could ignore. But even more than my suspicions about Diana, what troubled me the most was the realization that I couldn't go through with it myself. I had the freedom, the green light, to be with someone else if I wanted to, but I found that I didn't want to. Not really. The idea of being with another woman, even with Diana's blessing, felt wrong. It wasn't just about loyalty or love. It was something deeper, something intrinsic to who I was. I had tried to imagine it, to picture myself in that situation. I'd even thought about the women I knew, the ones who might be interested if I gave them the chance. But every time, I found myself pulling back, unable to cross that line. It wasn't just fear or guilt. It was a sense of hollowness, an emptiness that came with the thought of being with someone other than Diana. The truth was, I didn't want anyone else. I couldn't see myself with another woman, no matter how hard I tried. Even in the moments when I felt the most disconnected from Diana, when the doubts and frustrations were at their peak, I still couldn't bring myself to take that step. I loved her, and that love was more than just physical attraction or companionship. It was something that had been built over decades, something that couldn't be replicated with anyone else. The thought of betraying that love, even with her permission, felt like it would break something inside me. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that this agreement, this experiment we had set up, was more complicated than either of us had anticipated. There were moments when I almost asked her, almost broke the silence to find out if she had done it. But every time I stopped myself. What good would it do to know? Whether she had or hadn't, knowing wouldn't change the fact that I couldn't bring myself to do the same. It wouldn't change the way I felt about her or about us. In the quiet moments when I was alone, I found myself thinking more and more about what this all meant. Had we made a mistake by opening this door? Had we underestimated the impact it would have on our relationship, on our trust in each other? I didn't know the answers, and that uncertainty weighed heavily on me. But one thing I did know was that I couldn't go through with it. I couldn't be with someone else, not even once. And if Diana had gone through with it, I wasn't sure how I would handle that either. The thought of her with another man, even under the terms we had agreed upon, made my chest tighten with a mixture of jealousy, fear, and sadness. As I lay in bed beside her at night, I wondered if she felt the same way. Did she regret the agreement? Did she feel the same doubts and hesitations that I did? Or was she content, having found a way to satisfy her curiosity without it damaging what we had? I didn't know, and the not knowing was what tortured me the most. In the end, I realized that this wasn't something I could continue to live with. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that this arrangement was something I could handle. I needed to talk to Diana, to tell her how I felt, to find out where we stood. Maybe she had already gone through with it, or maybe she hadn't. But either way, we needed to figure out what this meant for us moving forward. And so I decided that the next time we had a quiet moment alone, I would bring it up. I would tell her the truth, that I couldn't go through with it, that I couldn't be with someone else, that even if she had, I didn't want this agreement to come between us, to create a rift that we couldn't repair. Because in the end, what mattered most to me wasn't the freedom to be with someone else. It was the life we had built together, the love we shared, and the future we still had ahead of us. And I wasn't willing to risk that, not for anything. When Diana left for her business trip, I tried to tell myself that everything was fine. We had agreed to this, no questions, no accusations, no guilt. But as soon as she was out the door, the uneasy calm I'd been clinging to began to unravel. The house felt empty without her, the silence thick and oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. The first night was the hardest. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. Where was she right now? Was she alone in her hotel room, or was she with someone else? I knew I wasn't supposed to think like this, that we had made an agreement, but the doubt and fear crept in like a poison, tainting everything. I reached for my phone more times than I could count, my thumb hovering over her number, wanting to call her, to hear her voice, to reassure myself that everything was okay. But every time, I stopped myself. What would I say? How could I ask her the question that was gnawing at me without breaking the fragile truce we'd established? Are you with someone else? The words sounded bitter and accusing even in my mind, so I would cancel the call, throw the phone back onto the nightstand, and try to push the thoughts away. But they always came back, stronger and more insistent, until I was drowning in them. I couldn't stop imagining her with another man, some faceless figure who was everything I wasn't. Someone younger, more exciting, someone who could give her the thrill she was looking for. The thought made my stomach churn. I could see it so clearly in my mind. Diana in bed with someone else, laughing, touching, doing all the things we used to do when we were still wrapped up in the newness of each other. I imagined her enjoying it, relishing the freedom to explore something different, something forbidden. And it made me sick. I got up, pacing the house in the middle of the night, unable to find any peace. The jealousy and anger burned inside me, hotter and more intense with every passing hour. I knew it was irrational. I had agreed to this after all, but knowing that didn't make it any easier to bear. The images in my mind, the thought of her with someone else, they were like daggers, twisting deeper with every breath. The next day was no better. I went through the motions, pretending everything was fine when I spoke to Diana on the phone, forcing a casual tone into my voice even as my insides twisted. She sounded normal, cheerful even, like nothing was wrong. And that only made it worse. Did she not feel what I was feeling? Did she not understand the agony I was going through? Or worse, was she too busy with someone else to notice? By the third night, I was a wreck. I hadn't slept more than a few hours since she left. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. I tried to distract myself, to focus on work, on anything but the empty bed beside me. But nothing helped. The anger and jealousy had taken root, and they weren't letting go. I grabbed my phone again, dialing her number almost automatically. My heart pounded in my chest as it rang, my mind screaming at me to stop, to hang up before it was too late. But I didn't. I let it ring, the sound echoing in the quiet house like a ticking bomb. "Hello?" Diana's voice came through, warm and familiar, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "Hi," I finally managed, my voice thick with emotion. "How's the trip going?" "It's good," she replied, sounding a little surprised. "Long days, but productive. How are you?" "I'm fine," I lied, swallowing the bitterness that rose in my throat. "Just missing you." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her smile on the other end of the line. "I miss you too, Pete. I'll be home soon." Home. The word felt like a lifeline, something to hold on to in the midst of the storm. But the jealousy was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, and I couldn't stop myself from asking, Are you alone?" Another pause, longer this time, and I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating as I waited for her answer. "Yes," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that I couldn't quite place. "Why do you ask?" "I don't know," I said quickly, trying to cover my tracks. "Just wondering." There was a silence between us, heavy and charged with all the things we weren't saying. I wanted to ask her outright, to demand to know if she had been with someone else, but I couldn't. We had agreed not to ask, not to accuse, but the doubt was eating me alive. "Pete," Diana said after a moment, her voice gentle, "is everything okay?" I wanted to tell her no, that nothing was okay, that I was falling apart without her, that the thought of her with someone else was driving me mad. But I couldn't, so I lied again. "Yeah, everything's fine, just tired, I guess." "All right," she said, though I could tell she wasn't convinced. "I'll be home soon. We'll talk then, okay?" "Okay," I agreed, though the thought of talking about this, of confronting what I feared, filled me with dread. "I love you, Diana." "I love you too, Pete." When we hung up, I was left with nothing but the silence and the dark, oppressive thoughts swirling in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of her with someone else, couldn't stop the jealousy and anger from consuming me. I wanted to scream, to break something, to do anything to release the tension that had been building up inside me. But there was nothing I could do. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, unable to escape the thoughts that haunted me. I had agreed to this, and now I was paying the price. And the worst part was, I didn't know how to stop it. As the days dragged on, I became more and more obsessed, replaying every conversation, every moment in my mind, looking for signs, for clues that she had been with someone else. But I found nothing, and the uncertainty was driving me to the brink. When Diana finally came home, I wasn't sure what I would say, or how I would face her. All I knew was that I couldn't go on like this, living with the doubt and the fear and the jealousy. Something had to give, and I feared that when it did, it would shatter everything we had built together. When Diana returned from her business trip, I could tell immediately that she sensed something was off. She walked through the door, her usual bright smile in place. But as soon as she saw my face, that smile faltered. I tried to hide it, to push down the turmoil that had been gnawing at me for days, but it was no use. I wasn't sure how to pretend anymore. "Pete, are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern as she set her bags down. "You look like you haven't slept in days." I forced a smile, but it felt hollow. "I'm fine," I lied, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew she wouldn't buy it. Diana walked over to me, placing a hand on my arm, her eyes searching mine. "You don't seem fine. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of my own thoughts pressing down on me. I had tried to keep it inside, tried to convince myself that everything was okay, but the truth was it wasn't. I couldn't stop the doubts, the fears, the images that had plagued me ever since she left. "I've been thinking," I started, my voice shaking slightly, "about what we talked about before you left. About you being with someone else." Diana's brow furrowed, and I could see the concern deepen in her eyes. "Pete, what are you talking about?" "I don't know," I said, running a hand through my hair, feeling the tension in my shoulders. "Ever since you left, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it, about whether or not you were with someone else. It's been eating away at me, Diana. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I just kept wondering, did you?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked hurt, but then she softened. She reached up to gently cup my face, her thumb brushing my cheek. "Oh, Pete, no, I didn't. I would never do that." I searched her eyes, looking for any sign that she was holding something back, but all I saw was sincerity. "But we agreed," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We said it was okay." Diana shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "We did. But when it came down to it, I couldn't do it. I couldn't betray you like that. I thought I could, but when I had the chance, I realized I didn't want anyone else. I only want you, Pete. You're the only one I see." Her words were like a balm to my soul, soothing the anxiety that had been clawing at me for weeks. I felt the tension in my body begin to ease, but the guilt remained, gnawing at me for doubting her in the first place. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to doubt you, but I couldn't help it. It was tearing me apart." She pulled me into her arms, holding me tightly. "I understand, Pete. I do, but I promise you I've never been unfaithful to you. Not in all the years we've been together, and not now. I love you too much to do that." I buried my face in her shoulder, breathing in her familiar scent, and for the first time in days I felt like I could finally breathe. The doubts, the fears, they began to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of relief. She was still mine, and I was still hers. Nothing had changed. We stood there in silence for a long time, just holding each other, until finally I pulled back to look at her. "You mean it? You couldn't go through with it either?" She smiled, a real, genuine smile that made my heart swell. "No, Pete, I couldn't. I thought I needed something different, something new, but when I was faced with the reality of it, I realized that I don't want different. I don't want new. I want you." Her words were like a weight lifting off my chest, and I couldn't help but smile back at her. "I feel the same way, Diana. I thought maybe I could do it too, but I couldn't. I didn't even want to. The thought of being with someone else, it just didn't feel right. It felt wrong." "I know," she said softly. "I think we both got a little lost, trying to figure out what we wanted, but I think this has shown us that what we really want is each other. We've built something special, Pete. It's not perfect and it's not always easy, but it's ours, and I don't want to lose that." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in my heart. "I don't want to lose it either. I love you, Diana. I love what we have." "I love you too," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like I didn't. This whole thing, it was a mistake. We don't need to look outside of us to find what we need. It's right here, between us." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I blinked them back, focusing on the woman in front of me, the woman I had loved for so many years, and who still, after all this time, loved me just as much. "Let's never do something like this again," I said, half laughing, half serious. "I don't think I can handle it." Diana laughed softly, nodding in agreement. "Agreed. No more experiments. Just us working through whatever comes our way, together." I pulled her close again, kissing her forehead, feeling a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in weeks. The storm had passed, and we had come out on the other side, stronger and more certain of our love for each other. It wasn't perfect, it never had been, and it never would be. But it was ours, and that was enough. As we stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together. Because in the end, that's what mattered most. Not the mistakes we'd made or the doubts we'd faced, but the love that had carried us through it all. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was going to be okay. Thank you for listening to my story. Perhaps our story will help couples in a similar situation.